Welcome to this interview with Brian Leiter, series editor for the Routledge Philosophers series. The series, launched in 2005, is one of the leading examples of its kind. Each volume introduces and assesses the arguments of a major Western philosopher. It has been 12 years since the Routledge Philosophers series was launched, and we have now seen the publication of the 25th title in the series. What was the vision for the series when it started?
So the series actually started in 2001. Was when Tony Bruce, the philosophy editor at Routledge, approached me about possibly doing this. Routledge in the 1970s had a series called the Routledge Arguments of the Philosophers, and that was very much aimed at scholars and specialists. And the idea of this series was to get, again, established scholars, but who could give an authoritative introduction to the major figures in the history of philosophy, and that's what we set out to do. We've now had the luxury, because the series has been so successful, that we've started to recruit some younger scholars to undertake some of the newer volumes. But the basic idea was for the Routledge Philosophers to be the place to turn to if you needed either a secondary text or you wanted an authoritative introduction by a distinguished scholar to a major figure in the history of philosophy.
The series presents introductions to the great Western philosophers, but also figures who are not philosophers, such as Darwin, Freud, and Einstein. How do you go about choosing which thinkers to include in the series?
So, in the case of the major philosophers, we're aiming for the ones that tend to be part of the curriculum just about everywhere philosophy is taught in the English-speaking world, obviously an English language series. For those who aren't strictly speaking philosophers like Darwin or Freud or Einstein, we're looking for figures whose intellectual contributions were so substantial that they were taken up, as it were, in philosophy and became sort of a central focus of philosophical scholarship. The nature of philosophy has always been that it has stood in a close relationship with other forms of human inquiry. Figures like Darwin, like Freud, like Einstein, given what they wrote about, given what they contributed to, it was inevitable that philosophers would care about their insights into the human mind, into the nature of physical reality, into the nature of space and time, and so on. And so we're always on the lookout for thinking about figures like that whom philosophers inevitably care about.
When writing a volume for the series, what should the author bear in mind to make the book successful?
So what we tell the authors, and this was a lot of the work we did early on in the series, was crafting a description of what we wanted from the authors. The danger here is, of course, when you are recruiting very distinguished specialists to write these volumes, that they will forget what it's like to be new to it. And so we encourage a somewhat standard structure. We want to have glossaries in there of important terms. We want both them to start out with something about biography and conclude with something about the reception of that particular thinker. And we try to press them to bear in mind, ideally we want the upper level undergraduate to be able to read this. We want a graduate student who doesn't necessarily work on the figure but wants a reliable guide to a particular philosopher to be able to use this. And we found that the most successful volumes are ones that the specialists are also interested in too. But sometimes we have to press back a little not to make things too specialized. Otherwise it would defeat the idea here that this is going to be a way for students and other scholars to get introduced to these figures.
Which philosopher do you think has had the greatest impact, and why?
It depends impact on what. I think in the history of Western philosophy, there's no way to, Plato and Aristotle loom very, very large. In the modern era, Descartes, Hume, Kant. But the reason I say impact on what is because sometimes philosophers have had very big impacts, not necessarily within the confines of philosophy. Kant, of course, has had an enormous impact on the philosophy of the last 200 years. Marx, a volume that I will be co-authoring with one of my PhD students over the next couple of years. Marx is a philosopher whose impact in the traditional canon of philosophy is not that great, but whose impact on the world, on the social sciences, on the other humanities, is without parallel. So impact varies depending on the kind of work these philosophers have done.
Who has been the greatest influence on your own work as a philosopher?
So I would say the two philosophers who've been most important for me are actually Marx and Nietzsche. Though we have commissioned another distinguished scholar of Nietzsche who I greatly respect, Maud Marie Clark, to do that volume, which should be out in the next couple of years. I wouldn't say I'm typical of philosophers in that regard. I do a lot of work on Nietzsche, and Nietzsche and Marx are distinguished by being not sort of part of the conventional canon, but in a way challenges to the conventional canon of philosophy, but I think with deep and profound insights for understanding what it is to be a human being, what human society is like, and what's really going on in the world around us. And that sometimes requires them to be quite skeptical about the traditional philosophical canon. But I don't think Tony Bruce invited me to do this series because of my somewhat iconoclastic interest in philosophy, and I try not to impose that, needless to say, on the series.
Can you tell us what is planned for the series? Who will it be covering next?
So in the works, we have Maud Marie Clark will be doing the volume on Nietzsche. And Maud Marie Clark she's in the mold of the initial authors we invited, very distinguished senior scholar in the field. People will want to get her take on the Nietzschean corpus. Similarly, my colleague at the University of Chicago, Candace Vogler, is working on the volume on Anscombe. Anscombe's 20th century English philosophers, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, also one of the most influential female philosophers of the 20th century. The timing for that one is good because there's been a real renaissance of interest in Anscombe's work. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in this book when it comes out. We're also branching out into some figures who may not be quite as well known as the Platos or the Nietzsche. So, for example, Ernst Cassirer, a European philosopher of the 20th century, broadly in the Neo-Kantian traditions. In the year 1940, people probably would have said he's one of the philosophical greats of all time. His fortunes have, ebbed and flowed a bit over time. There's now renewed interest in him. Samantha Mathern, excellent young scholar at the University of California, Santa Cruz, is going to be doing the volume on Cassirer. Of the major figures, we've done pretty well at covering the major figures of the traditional canon. The volume on George Berkeley by Lisa Downing at Ohio State and David Hilbert at the University of Illinois. And we're in the process of commissioning the Descartes volume, which is one of the only sort of among the really major figures that we haven't been able to cover yet. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be working on Marx with a young scholar named Jamie Edwards. And that's, I think, what's on the immediate horizon. One of the questions we've been talking about is other figures that, again, are maybe outside a little bit of the conventional canon. We're going to try to get a volume on Henri Bergson, who was an enormous figure in 20th century French philosophy and has sort of faded from the scene. Oh, we do have a volume on Jean-Paul Sartre that is under contract and in progress, and I think that will be a nice addition and very useful for students because Sartre is very difficult to read, even by the standards of philosophy.